So how do we identify sedimentary rocks? There are a few main steps. The first step is to examine the rock's texture. Are there any visible grains that can be seen? In this sample, there are visible grains. So once you decide that, then you need to figure out the size of the clasts. Are they big, like boulder or cobble sized? Are they sand sized, or are they silt sized? Silt generally means, are the clasts enough where they're just like picking up a handful of sand? Or are they much more fine grained? If they're much more fine grained, so you can't really make out each one of the individual clasts, it is most likely silt. If it is sand sized, so just like a nice handful of beach sand, and you can make out each one of the clasts for the most part, then it is likely sand sized. If they are bigger pieces of rock, then it is likely pebble sized. And then you want to look at some clues to identification. Are the clasts angular? Are they rounded? Can you make out the individual minerals like quartz or feldspar? Is the rock texture more fine, or is it gritty? And then you can be able to then discern and extrapolate out the rock name based on some of those discrete identifiers. So what happens if the rock doesn't contain any visible clasts? Does it look to appear as if the rock has a crystalline texture? As if it looks like it's just formed from a bunch of individual crystals? A good example in your box that does not have visible clasts, but does have some sort of visible crystals, would be this granular halite, which looks like it has all these little tiny little halite pieces, which are essentially pieces of salt, very, very tiny pieces of salt that have precipitated out from some kind of fluid. But what if it doesn't have any visible texture? Does the rock have visible shells? A good example of a rock in your box that has visible shells is this fossiliferous limestone, where you can see some of the imprints on where there used to be shells, and now what's left behind is just an imprint of that shell. Or you can actually see some places where you have just an outline of the shell, not necessarily an imprint. So it does look like it was comprised of some shells like clams and other kind of bivalves, then it is likely a type of limestone, in this case a fossiliferous limestone. But what if it doesn't have any visible shells? Well, then you want to use other kinds of physical properties and physical testing properties. And a good one that you can use are the materials that are in your rock and mineral box. That includes your ceramic plate, that includes the nail, and that also includes your penny, and then the most obvious one, using your nail. So using your scratch test. If it can't be scratched by a nail or knife, it means it is a much harder rock like chert. If your nail or knife will scratch it, and a fingernail may scratch it, let's try this piece of coal here, where my fingernail doesn't necessarily scratch it, but this nail does scratch it, then it could be a piece of coal. If it is softer than a fingernail, then maybe it is a shale. Or if it can be scratched by a nail and it can't be scratched by your fingernail, then it could be a limestone. So there are many other different properties that can use to test to figure out what your sedimentary rock is. So the first step, just to recap, is to examine the rock's texture. Does it contain visible clasts? If no, does the rock have a crystalline texture? If no, does the rock have visible shells? And if it doesn't have any visible clasts, it doesn't look like it has a crystalline texture, or it doesn't look like it has any visible fossils, then you need to use your other physical property testers, which, going back to our mineral hardness, and using your hardness kit.